This episode is sponsored by JustCarbon. JustCarbon simplifies offsetting carbon emissions and supports high-quality carbon removal projects to combat climate change. To find out more, visit www.justcarbon.com.
Welcome to the latest First Voice podcast, brought to you by First Voice magazine, the official flagship magazine of the Federation of Small Businesses, and the go-to podcast for news, tips, and important information for small businesses and the self-employed. This episode, we will be exploring why an increasing number of small businesses are looking to measure and offset their carbon emissions, including how you can begin to do so for your small business. And this episode is produced in partnership with JustCarbon, a blockchain-based carbon marketplace that simplifies offsetting carbon emissions through the purchase of carbon tokens called JustCarbon removal tokens, while supporting high-quality carbon sequestration projects. Now, we know that sustainability and environmental issues are rising rapidly up the corporate agenda, but they are also becoming increasingly important for small businesses. So in this episode, we will look at the reasons for that, the benefits for small businesses of being carbon conscious, and we'll demystify the process of carbon offsetting so you can begin offsetting your own carbon footprint if you wish to do so. To help me discuss this topic, I'm pleased to say I'm joined by two guests. John Auckland is the founder of global crowdfunding agency Tribe First and an experienced entrepreneur. And Adrian Rimmer is a climate market veteran and formerly the CEO of Gold Standard. Thank you both for joining me. I want to start by talking about why small businesses should be thinking about this. John, I'll come to you first. Small businesses are busy with the day-to-day. They've been through a prolonged period of uncertainty, yet despite that, are we seeing increased awareness and desire among small businesses to offset their carbon? What's the demand like among small businesses?
It's a bit of a mixed bag. As you say, the pressures of COVID and rising cost and inflation are impacting businesses significantly, especially when it comes to their workforce. So you may think that having a focus on carbon emissions and reaching sort of net zero is not top of their priority. But what I'm quite heartened to see is when we're out there speaking to businesses, just how many companies really do have a desire to make an impact and make a change. I guess COVID's made people think a lot differently about many things. It's a bit of a chance of a reset, and so fortunately, it doesn't seem like the urgency's gone away. If you think about 50% of all UK business carbon emissions comes from small businesses, so defined as companies with fewer than 249 employees. Which is around about 34% of the overall UK carbon emissions. And so, we need to tap into the small business community in order to achieve our net zero targets. So I don't think enough's being done by the government to incentivize small businesses to engage with the voluntary carbon market and buy carbon credits. But there's certainly demand from the small businesses themselves, which is pretty reassuring and heartwarming. There was a survey completed by BT and Small Business Britain, and they found that although 99% of small firms recognise the importance of sustainability, only three-quarters of them, so 77%, three-quarters of them, 77% didn't know how to measure their carbon emissions and said they needed support, which is a crazy number. So, that's part of our job, I think, is to help educate SME audiences as to how they can reduce their offset their carbon emissions, and it's also our job to make it incredibly easy for them. So that's one of the kind of raison d'etres of JustCarbon, is to make the market more accessible to more people, and especially to small businesses.
Okay, so there's growing awareness around the issue amongst small businesses. But Adrian, I'll bring you in. What are the reasons small businesses should look to offset their carbon? And Is it likely to become increasingly important for them as they come under increasing pressure from the firms they supply and consumers and so on?
Yeah, well, I mean that in a sense is the reason that small businesses should be looking at this issue. There's an increasing groundswell of engagement from corporates, from the financial sector, and from regulators around carbon emissions. And so in each of those cases, the fundamental issue is driving towards carbon accounting for companies of all sizes. So understanding what your carbon footprint is, and then addressing it. So putting in measures to reduce it, and then to address the unavoidable balance. I'll start with just take each in turn. Large corporates now are having to report on climate risk and on their transition strategies. A large part of their footprint is often part of their supply chain. So they are pushing down requirements to their suppliers, often small businesses, to provide measurement and to show themselves what they're doing about climate. And as a small business, it's really quite hard. Often, unless you're a manufacturer, your footprint will often be your energy bill. And so a combination of your electricity and your gas bill, that makes it quite easy to calculate, but it makes it quite hard to do much about it unless you're once you've done the obvious energy efficiency type activities, and therefore offsetting the balance is a way of showing that you understand what that footprint is and that you're taking measures to compensate for that. So that's part of it in terms of addressing procurement as part of the supply chain of a larger company. Banks are increasingly making commitments for net zero. And the way that they are implementing that is to look across their lending portfolio and calculate the emissions associated with that. So increasingly, they are requiring their clients to do the same as the corporates, to really look at what their footprint is and take steps to address it. And then finally, regulators are starting with the largest companies. So there was an announcement this week around the creation of a transition task force, but that's going to set rules for how companies define their transition plans. That is how they're going to move to a net zero processes going forward. And whilst that's aimed at the largest companies that are listed on the stock market to begin with, the Financial Conduct Authority has been very clear that it's going to extend that through the powers it has, particularly through its regulation of the financial sector, to push that through the economy. So it's in the interest of companies to get ahead of that and take advantage of the positioning it offers them. So to calculate their footprint, and there are a range of calculators, particularly if you focus on your sort of really the direct footprint around your energy usage, and then to offset the balance.
Yeah, John, anything to add on why this should matter to small businesses?
Yeah, so I guess I want to talk a bit about the future and why companies should act now rather than procrastinate too much. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the price of carbon credits is predicted to go up. Look at Mark Hardy's task force for scaling the voluntary carbon markets, and he's saying that the price of a ton of carbon for a carbon credit needs to come up to $120, around about $25 to $37. That's what we're currently selling JCRs for our JustCarbon removal token, is where it is now. So that price is likely to increase, and I think everyone sort of commonly agrees that they will do. So if you procrastinate too much, then obviously the cost is going to get higher, versus actually if you look at your emissions now, it may well be worth you sort of hedging for the next few years to save yourself money. The second reason is much more, we're kind of facing this paradigm shift of the conscientious consumer. If you think conscientious consumerism is a relatively new movement, certainly for being a sort of mainstream movement rather than a fringe movement. But if you fast forward 5 years into the future, conscientious consumers will be the norm, and they will actively look for bad businesses and bad business practices to make a conscious decision to not purchase from them. So you need to start that process now of thinking about how you can protect yourself against this future. And one of the best ways of doing this is obviously thinking about your net zero strategy and your carbon impacts.
Yeah, and Adrian, how exactly does carbon offsetting work? I'm sure a lot of our audience have heard of it, but not all of them will be clear on exactly how carbon offsetting works.
Sure. Essentially, the way that this mechanism works, it was developed 20 years ago under what was the Kyoto Protocol. Some maybe remember that in the dim and distant past. But essentially, it's the concept that once you have reduced your emissions to a certain degree, it becomes increasingly costly to do that. And yet, actually, in terms of global warming, it doesn't really matter where you reduce emissions in the world. So if somebody else can do that more cheaply, it makes sense to outsource that process to them once you've got to a certain point within your process. In order to do that, there needs to be a process that you're measuring things that wouldn't otherwise have happened. So if somebody would be reducing their emissions anyway, you can't take credit for that. But if you are funding a project that otherwise wouldn't take place, and nature-based projects, which is what we focus on at JustCarbon, are a good example of that, where there's no revenue stream to keeping a forest standing, but it plays an incredibly important role in sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So if you can support a project that protects that forest and provides a revenue stream to it to make that possible, then you can account for the carbon that's being sequestered, and you can use that to offset your own footprint. So fundamentally, it's about funding activities around the world that wouldn't otherwise take place that reduce emissions in the atmosphere. And there's a complex process around that. I used to run the Gold Standard, which is a certification body which sets the rules and the accounting frameworks for that. And every emission reduction is certified independently to have taken place. So there's a lot of rigor around the accounting process, and those offset buyers are effectively claiming title to the emission reduction that they funded.
Okay, so John, look, Adrian mentioned there that there's a process. How long does this take? What are the practicalities for small businesses?
Look, a small business can buy a carbon credit relatively instantaneously. It's just they don't know, in my experience, where to look to buy in the first place. It's not a simple thing of even just Googling buy carbon credit or buy carbon offset. There's a plethora of choice, and there's a extreme spectrum of quality when it comes to carbon credits. And so the average small business would probably find themselves Googling, where do I offset my carbon emissions, and finding themselves at either a calculator or a non-accredited carbon scheme, such as a tree planting project. So there's various things that will plant trees for you, and so you buy an unmeasured carbon reduction by planting a tree, so it makes you feel good, but to a certain degree it's greenwashing, because you've got no real sense of how much carbon has actually been removed, or whether there's any direct correlation between the carbon you've emitted and the carbon you've removed by paying for the tree to be planted. So my recommendation is for a small business to go and start with a calculator to work out what your scope 1, 2, and ideally 3 emissions are. So scope 3 is anything to do with your supply chain or your customer base. Scope 1 and 2 are emissions directly related to your activities. So you need to start at some stage with a calculator. You can go on to the JustCarbon website. We've got some calculators that we recommend. Carbon Trust has also got a really good SME calculator. So start there and work out how much you emit, and then search the market to decide what you think is the best solution for offsetting. Now, this is one of the reasons why JustCarbon needs to exist, is that it's actually quite hard for the a small business market, to engage with the carbon credit market. Typically, deals that are brokered are designed for large corporates. There are brokers that act as intermediaries between the project developers and the customers, and they generally tend to do a large volume because they tend to work on commissions or margins on the cost of the carbon credit. And so what JustCarbon allows is for you to, once you've done your calculation, is to buy with relative ease. It's for non-blockchain experienced people, it's probably quite complicated when you first look at it, but actually we're simplifying the user journey over time. But yeah, just visiting justcarbon.com and navigating to the section that says buy and retire or buy and offset, you can buy instantly however many JCRs you need to buy, so carbon credits you need to buy, and it will immediately retire them for them, both from the blockchain and from the carbon credit registries. So we've incredibly simplified the process. If you want to go a step further and start to sort of hedge future years' carbon emissions, you can do so. And the process for doing that is to work with one of the third-party exchanges that we partnered with, and you go onto their platform, create an account, and you buy JCRs from the market. It's a liquid market, meaning there are always buyers and sellers on either side. Some of them are speculators, some of them are project developers directly, some of them are liquidity providers who bought carbon credits to put on there to sell, to any sort of given time. And we're also using a technology partner called Chintai that will make that side of things even simpler, because you'll be able to go onto their platform, create an account, which automatically creates you a wallet that allows you to buy JCRs and retire them whenever you so wish, or sell them on if you decide that you wanted to buy 5 years worth of predicted carbon credits, offsets, and through activities that have reduced your emissions, which we obviously encourage, realize you didn't need as many as you bought for those 5 years. You can then also sell them back to the market. So we're trying to create a really simple solution for SMEs that hasn't really existed until now.
Great. And we talked a little bit around calculators there, and we talked around some of the things that are carbon intensive for small businesses, like energy use and things like that. But Adrian, some small businesses probably aren't sure whether they even are carbon intensive or not. And I'm assuming that some sectors are bigger users than others. What's a good place to start to see if you're carbon intensive and if you should be offsetting?
I think the first point I make is that actually all businesses, whatever size, have a carbon footprint and should be thinking about how they manage it. It actually, in some cases, if you've got a smaller carbon footprint, it's much easier to show you're taking action on climate, because you can simply use your energy bill, a simple calculator, and come up with a relatively small tonnage and offset the balance. For larger organizations, particularly SMEs that are manufacturing, they would typically be those that have or are involved in IT services where there is a large use of data centers, for example. Those types of organizations are much more likely to be sort of much more energy intensive. Again, however, it's a function of in simplistic terms of your energy consumption. And so the place to start for any business is really looking at your electricity bill, your gas bill, and then thinking about things like if you have staff that have company cars, where the emissions associated with their activities. And again, there are very simplified calculators that allow you to do that. And then, as John mentioned, scope 3 is where you start looking at the impact of in your supply chain, or in terms of the use of the products that you produce. Now that gets much more complicated. The reality is that right now, dealing with the first two scopes should be the priority, because they're easy to address, and therefore, when corporates or financiers are looking to see if you're taking action, that's an obvious place to see that you've got going. There'll be much more understanding of having of a more complex supply chain and how to calculate that. But I think those are the sort of starting points, and then really it's about thinking about how you're going to reduce that footprint first. Now, an obvious area is many companies are moving to electric car fleets. They're buying green energy, and so you can address some of those reduction requirements easily and efficiently by buying the right sort of tariffs. So thinking about where you can reduce energy, and you can engage your staff in that process. And often that's quite interesting. Companies, people who work for any size of company are often keen to know that they're part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so engaging staff can be quite an effective use of a kind of way to kind of build sort of loyalty within the business, and see that they're playing a part in managing the company for the longer term. But engage them in that process, come up with ideas for reducing, and once you've implemented what you can, the residual footprint is what you should be looking to address. And so that's then saying that that's a simple function of the sort of tons that you've reduced, the tons that you're reducing, and what's left over. And really then that's when a platform like JustCarbon becomes much more sensible, because you can simply go there, procure those, retire them straight away, and report that into your sustainability reports or on your website, etc., and disclose the process that you've undertaken.
Okay, brilliant. And look, cost is always important to small businesses, not least as they stare down rising costs of doing business and an ongoing period of uncertainty. What are the cost implications of this, John?
So often businesses are quite surprised to discover the cost. And I guess there's also, it's worth noting that the cost varies quite dramatically if you just focus on scope 1 and scope 2, or whether you also decide to include scope 3. The difference between the two really is including scope 3 is much more honest, and you normally need to engage an agency to support with that process, because as Adrian said, it's quite complex and a far sort of higher degree of accounting and looking back through communicating with your customers and finding out what their engagement with you is and your suppliers and so on and so forth. So it just takes time. But even when you factor in scope 3, a lot of times companies are quite surprised at the cost. So I'll take an example. There's a coffee roaster, for example. Their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. This is just a case study of an example you can find on the small99.co.uk website. They took some data supplied by C3, where they supply a number of different case studies of different types of businesses. And one of these being a coffee roaster, they roast about 15 tons of coffee per year. Their scope 1 and 2 emissions would only be about sort of 7 or 8 tons. When they factor in scope 3, then it goes up to 31. So for them to, if they're buying just carbon removal tokens to offset that at $37 a ton, that's only costing them £917 a year in order to go carbon neutral. And then you've got a jewelry retailer that has 2 retail shops, physical retail shops, which the built environment obviously has quite high emissions, and also people traveling there. So part of your scope 3 is also thinking about how your customers actually come to visit you or travel to you. And their carbon footprint is still only 61 tons. So for about £1,700, sorry, they'd be able to go carbon neutral, which they can quite easily factor into the cost of into their margins, pass the cost on to their customers. But you may think it's not that important now, but if you look forward into the future when it's potentially $100, $120 per ton, then obviously that cost does go up quite significantly. And the way you reduce that cost in the future is either hedging now by buying in advance, buying your future needs, or you reduce your emissions. And obviously we encourage people to do both, really. I mean, the good thing about hedging your future requirements, or indeed scrubbing past emissions, both of them get money back to project developers sooner. So it also initiates further climate action sooner, and gets more money back into the project developers, who typically then reinvest any money that they get back into further climate action. So yeah, there's good reasons all around, really, to move faster and not procrastinate too much. And also, you might be pleasantly surprised at the costs. In terms of getting an agency to support you with identifying your scope 3 emissions, it's hard to do that via a calculator. So typically that's done through someone coming in and supporting you. Those costs can vary wildly. I mean, I know some people that are paid as little as 600. I know £600. I know some people, still small businesses, that are paid more like £10,000. So that's sort of the ballpark you're working with for a small business, but it really can vary. And just do your homework, really, on the different types of agencies you can work with.
I just add in there, there's the Carbon Trust has been really helpful for small businesses, and there are resources from companies like Sage who are looking into this and have sort of whole climate resource sections on thinking around disclosure and around measurement. So there are plenty of resources that small businesses can find on these issues. The other thing I'd say, of course, is there's 2 issues. One is once you start measuring, then you start managing. So by actually undertaking a measurement, a sort of footprinting of your organization, you see where there is cost. And carbon is simply a function, as I mentioned several times, of an energy bill. Well, ultimately, if you reduce, you're going to reduce your energy bill. So compensating for the balance is actually, can to some degree pay for itself. And then the other thing is thinking about how you build this into your business model. So actually making virtue of this in terms of the way that you engage with your customers. And I'll give you an example of a ferry company in Australia that started to provide a service that was a ticket that built into it an offset. So passengers could choose to buy their weekly ticket in a normal weekly ticket, or they could buy a slightly more expensive ticket that included an offset. So actually, in this case, the company was passing on that cost to clients through a more expensive ticket. Now, what was really interesting about that is that they made the standard ticket red and the offset ticket green. And within a very short space of time, most customers were buying the green ticket. And there's the sort of visible signal of the action that they were able to take simply by buying a slightly more expensive but carbon neutral journey, made a huge difference in terms of the way that they went about their daily commute, and in terms of the kind of brand of the ferry company in terms of providing that too. So I think there are smart ways of thinking about how you build this into your business and into your marketing and communication activity as well.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And John, just finally, where else can small businesses find more information about how to get going on this?
So visit the JustCarbon website, www.justcarbon.com. You can get plenty of information there. I'd also recommend you follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We give lots of tips and advice about reducing carbon emissions, market stats, the various things that you'll find useful as a small business owner.
Brilliant, John and Adrian. Thanks so much for sharing those insights on an area that I think a lot of small businesses are hearing about, but perhaps not yet active on. It's really interesting. Thanks very much for your time. Thank you also to our audience for listening. While I have your attention, I would just like to remind you that you can subscribe to the First Voice podcast to receive regular updates and guidance on the big issues affecting small businesses. And do please also remember that you can find a whole host of additional webinars, podcasts, and other content on the First Voice website at firstvoice.fsb.org.uk. Many thanks.
This episode is sponsored by JustCarbon. JustCarbon simplifies offsetting carbon emissions and supports high-quality carbon removal projects to combat climate change. To find out more, visit www.justcarbon.com.